First of all, give us a bit of background. How did you end up being, sitting at the sharp end of an aeroplane?
Well, originally after having done compulsory military training and learning to fly on Tiger Moths, I applied to go into the Air Force for territorial flying. And the day I was due to go for my interview for territorial stuff, National Airways sent me a letter saying that they wanted me to train for National Airways in the Air Force to do a wings course and then go straight onto commercial flying, which was wonderful because it meant that I finished my wings course at Wigram, went to Harewood, and immediately began to fly Herons and DC-3s. So that was the beginning of it all.
And did you have an ambition to fly? Was it something?
Oh, yes. From way back. My flying career began at 3 years of age because we lived next door to McGregor's in Palmerston North, and Mac McGregor, along with Johnny Walker, Harry Walker, they flew the Mildenhall to Melbourne air race in 1934. And so they did that in a twin open cockpit Miles aircraft. So they literally did that entire journey from England to Melbourne in an open cockpit aircraft.
I mean, it's not the real pioneering days of flying, but it's not that far removed from it. We're talking about an era where post-war, we're getting over that. A lot of the equipment available for airline development is wartime machines. Take us back to the technology, and sort of what was it like in the commercial world back in that day in flying?
Well, in the 1930s, when as I say, when I was a child, you were talking about virtually canvas and wood aircraft to a large degree. And they were just developing aircraft. The DC-2 flew in that same air race, and then the DC-3 followed. So at that time, and in New Zealand at the same time, McGregor and Walker, when they returned to New Zealand, they virtually began commercial aviation in New Zealand with Union Airways. And Union Airways became National Airways eventually. And then Air New Zealand was another thing altogether because it came into being from Teal, from Tasman Empire Airways Limited, and it went on from the flying boats onto the Electras, the four-engine Electras, and then, of course, onto the jet, the DC-8 in 1965.
There weren't any jets around when you were starting out on your career, I would imagine. There might have been a few military jets around, but nothing civil.
Well, I guess the first jets that were around were virtually just post-war time. There was the Meteor, which visited, and then the Vampire aircraft were part of the New Zealand Air Force too. So they were beginning to fly, but nothing like a commercial jet aircraft. And that wasn't until the DC-8 arrived in 1965.
You would have been watching the developments, though, in technology.
Oh, yes.
And I guess it was the obvious things like the Comet and aircraft like that caught your eye.
Yes, oh yes, very much so. And of course, when it came time for Air New Zealand to buy a jet aircraft, the Comet was a contender. The Convair 880, the 707, and the DC-8, they were all in the mix as well. What happened was that when it came to developing the four-engine jets, the manufacturers were given a specification that the airlines wanted, and those three aircraft, the 707, Convair 880, and the DC-8, were all kind of generated at the same time, and offered as a possibility, and Air New Zealand chose the DC-8.
And of course, back in those days, Douglas was the premier passenger aircraft manufacturer, wasn't it? That's where they'd come from. Boeing more military. Yet at that point, the battle, you mentioned those three types, the battle was really on for supremacy.
It was in some ways, yes. And the 707, of course, was a derivative from the United States military, the DC-8 was in fact a new thing for Douglas at that stage, following on from the DC-3 and DC-3. DC-4, DC-6, and there was a DC-5, I think, as well. But then on to the DC-8.
And Air New Zealand chose Douglas. They had DC-3s. They had DC-3s left over from the Air Force, I think, the transport squadron after the war that built the local airline system. Was there a commonality or a familiarity with the manufacturer and the product, or was that just selected on its own merit?
I think on its own merits, because there was some political contention about getting Douglas rather than British, because, as I say, the Comet was in contention at that stage as well. There was the Vickers aircraft, and it was a matter of do we buy British or do we buy American. And so, as I say, the DC-8 was to a degree in contention. But I think, from my own point of view, I think it was the aircraft to have got.
Qantas went with the 707?
Yes.
Why do you think they went with Boeing and we went with Douglas?
I do not know.
No, that's the answer to that.
Yes, as I say, having had, because NAC at that time, when we were operating at Paraparam here, NAC had about 27, I think, DC-3s, and we literally flew to all of the airfields in the country from this airport. And
would it be fair to say that DC-3, like so many countries around the world, that really our domestic airline system really was that was the rock in which it was built?
It was an aircraft that you could virtually do anything with. It was a very friendly aircraft, and to fly it was an old style hands-on aeroplane, and it flew at low altitude, which meant that your passengers, and this was of course a development that was introduced by SPAN, South Pacific Airlines of New Zealand, and they they initiated the large window aspect of the cabin, and NAC followed suit, and they had these large window aircraft, which overseas tourists really delighted in because the aircraft flew at low altitude. We very often used to take passengers up over the mountains and round Lake Taupo, up over the Hooker Falls, up the river up to Hamilton, and so they got a lot for their money in terms of viewing.
Can you remember the first time you saw a DC-8? Was it an actual aircraft, or was it pictures of them, or
the aircraft? Yes, in fact, I've got a photo of the aircraft on delivery, the first aircraft on delivery landing at Auckland. It was a kind of a large open day at the airport, and the 8 came in and landed, and that was my first view of the aircraft.
What did you think?
I thought, wow. And the interesting thing was that I had actually applied to join Air New Zealand and to go onto the jets from NAC a long time beforehand, because there was literally the beginning of a pilot shortage at that stage, and so we were the ones that were selected to go onto the 8. Knew all about it and knew the fact that they were going to very nearly a year ahead of the time. And then we gathered in Auckland in December '65 and did our training right on the aircraft at that time, which I must say was a very hot time to go doing manhandling of a jet that you'd never flown before.
People obviously are used to watching videos now and seeing people training in flight simulators and so on and so forth, and they've got to an incredible degree of realism. But we're talking about an era, well, there were flight simulators, but there only so much you could do with them, and I believe that probably Air New Zealand hadn't received one early on. So it was all hands-on in the real plane. What's that like?
It's slightly staggering when you go from a DC-3, which is two things that whirl around outside and drag you along, to this monster that has 4 engines that don't have any kind of apparent means of support. It is quite startling. The 8 had 9 tanks in the wing and the centre structure to carry fuel. There was a main tank and an auxiliary tank for each engine, so that's 8, and then there was a centre wing auxiliary tank in the fuselage area. The amount of fuel in that centre wing auxiliary tank, when full, weighed more than the all-up weight of a DC-3. And so that was in essence, you were going from an aircraft to this other aircraft that where the fuel tankage alone weighed more than the aircraft you'd been flying.
Wow, well, that sort of says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, you're talking about a new method of propulsion. How much understanding or how much coming up to speed was there with knowing how these new systems worked, or was it just a sort of like an evolution of Douglas technology? Because people have said to me, if you look at a DC-8 and a DC-3 or any of those piston planes from Douglas, you'll find the same knobs, the same switches, the same cable runs.
Yep.
Obviously, it was an evolution more than a complete, new start, wasn't it?
Well, one of the beauties about the DC-8, as against any of the other aircraft, was the fact that the control surfaces were all coupled to the things that you control those with by wires, by physical wires, not electronic wires. And so you knew that when you worked the ailerons that there was a cable running out there that actually worked the ailerons, the same with the elevators and rudders. And you had the comfort of knowing that you could virtually lose every system in the aircraft. You could lose your hydraulics, pneumatics, electrics, and you could still fly the aeroplane. And it was very heavy to fly, but we actually did it in training and simulation. And the other aspect of it was, excuse me, to the manoeuvres that we did. Of course, we, like an ab initio training where you do circuits and landings and overshoots and things like that, we were doing them on the aircraft, which nowadays, or not long after, you would not do on the aircraft. You'd only do it on a simulator. Several reasons. One is it was very tough on the tyres, and you were running around in circuits. You would do a circuit, you'd do a touchdown, and then it would be power on, and you'd do a go round, and it was pretty wearing on the aircraft. In fact, there was one very tragic day when there was a loud explosion. And what had happened was that the anti-skid had failed on the aircraft, and they put the brakes on and blew all of the tyres in one go. So they kind of were a bit easier on them after that. But it was a very, very easy aeroplane to fly in that sense. And we did things like our emergency descents for real. We used to do them out over the Gulf, kind of north of White Island. And I don't know what the fishermen down below thought of us, but this thundering great thing coming out of the sky. But to do a real emergency descent in the aircraft, the thing that it really did, you didn't do it in a simulator, you'd done it in the real aircraft, and you knew it could do it, and that was a real comfort.
Here's a question. If you were to compare doing those drills in a simulator with actually using a live aircraft, in the live situation, are you better off with live experience versus simulator? Personally,
I would be, yes. I very much appreciated that opportunity to do that, though I did become a simulator instructor, and so I experienced that as well. But I would have to say that the real hands-on experience in the real aircraft way better than the simulator in many ways.
Must have been quite exhilarating. How did you feel at the end of training session like that, you'd sort of be buzzing a bit, wouldn't you?
We're a bit worn out because the thing was, the instructor would take several of the trainees up, and we'd do descents one after the other. So it would be a case of belting down from just over 30,000 down to 14,000, climbing back again and doing another one with one of the other crew, and so you kind of felt the stress a wee bit, but it was good to know it worked.
I've heard that Boeing aircraft are described as fly by numbers. You set up the numbers correctly, and you'll always, every time, it'll go well. Were Douglas aircraft the same? Everything was flown to settings and numbers, charts and scales.
There were numbers virtually for all of the different parameters, like the speed at which you dumped fuel and the speed at which you did various other things in the aircraft. So those were all spelt out, so in that sense they were very much the same.
What about reliability? I mean, with a new airline getting into the world of jets and with relatively long sectors, I would have imagined, even back in that day, considering our location. What were they like day to day?
Well, in all of the years I flew it, you're talking about 10 years, I never had a thing where I could take a sharp breath. We just had no real problems at all. Air New Zealand adopted the engine that we had, the Pratt & Whitney engine, was a double-rated engine where there was... it had been beefed up, if you like, to operate at higher settings, but in fact that the lower settings that were given were the aircraft performed just as well, but this higher setting was what you could use if you really wanted to. But Air New Zealand made it so that while it was a high-rated engine, you operated it at the lower setting. And it actually increased the service time between the hot section haul downs on the engines to a tremendous degree, where I cannot remember the exact figures, but literally the engine hot section to be hauled down for servicing extended out to about 4 years, if I remember right. So you didn't have to haul the thing apart unless you really had something else. So, and that was a major service on the engine. It saved a tremendous amount of money, and you had that confidence that the thing worked really well. And as I say, the downgrading of the power that you used extended the life of the engine quite considerably.
How long did it take to move to, presuming you started as a co-pilot?
Yes.
And then moved to the left seat. How long did that take you?
Oh, goodness me. It was, when did I start? 65. I got my command in the early 70s. It was around about 6 years, I should think, if I remember right, before I got into command.
And they make that selection process, just through the hours you've done and the service you've given? Do they your name pops up on a list? How does it work?
Well, there was a pecking order, if you like, in terms of promotion, where all of us were on a list which you clambered uphill, and it just happened in those cases. It was the same in National Airways with the DC-3s, and it was the requirement more than anything else, the number of services that you were operating, how many crew you needed to actually operate those services.
And what was it like being the boss?
Oh, I didn't ever regard being the boss as kind of essential. I looked on the thing, flying the thing, as it was a melding, if you like, of 3 minds, 4 minds on the flight deck, because we had right through to the time I finished, we dropped the navigator part way through the time I was flying, but we had the flight engineer, first officer and captain, and it's a team effort, so it's very good to have confidence that you've got a team beside you.
Flight engineers, of course, are sort of consigned to history now. You read a lot of opinion about whether that's a good or a bad thing, even just for those extra set of eyes. Is there anything in that?
Oh yes.
So
There's as many sets of eyes as you can have, especially when you're on approach and doing landings, and perhaps in obscure conditions where it's handy to have another set of eyes. Not only watching outside, but also watching inside on the instrumentation. The flight engineer performed a very good function on the 8. Of course, it was a matter of looking after fuel tanks, the distribution of the fuel. It was a matter of monitoring engine parameters so that you knew that what was happening was what should happen. And they had the chance of foreseeing, if you like, anything by looking at their instrument panel. They could tell you, hey, there's something looking not quite right, and you could actually check it. But a flight engineer in the 8 circumstance was very good, because there was the electrical system, which was quite a complex electrical system, because each engine had a generator. Those generators had to be matched in terms of their frequency and phase locking and things. So, the flight engineer was a very worthwhile person on the flight deck.
Before we get on into the service life, but just training again. Of course, everyone will be aware of the crash that happened to, I think, the second DC-8. NZB was the registration. And there are pictures around of that terrible day. I think people died in that crash. What happened there?
Well, in training on the aircraft, and again, this was perhaps the fact that we were training on the aircraft, you had to practice engine outs on when you were taking off. You might have a failure of an engine. This was done in training all the time, where you would initiate a takeoff. The person being trained would initiate a takeoff, and then the training captain would close down one of the outer engines. Usually it was an outer engine, and the trainee would have to cope with that. And the shutting down of the engine was accomplished by just reaching to the power levers and just hauling it backwards sharply, so that it simulated a failure of power on that engine. Now that was fine, but the reverse thrust levers were hinged at the top of the power levers and dangling forward, and so when you wanted to reverse the engine, when you landed, after landing, you would reach forward and grasp the power levers, the reverse power levers, and pull them up into what was known as reverse idle. And then when you wanted reverse thrust, you'd pull them backwards, and they would apply reverse power. So in other words, the hanging of those reverse thrust levers, it was a hinge at the top of the throttle, or power lever rather than a throttle. And so what happened in this case was that the captain reached across, training captain, and they'd just become airborne at full power, and he reached across and flicked one of the power levers backwards to shut the thing down. And what happened, which no one had kind of expected or experienced, was that the reverse thrust lever, literally the inertia of it, flew the reverse thrust lever up into reverse idle. But the only thing was that the power, it was on full power forward, and here suddenly it went into reverse, and instead of just being reverse idle, it gave literally full reverse thrust, because the reverse thrust lever flew upwards into reverse. And that, of course, was totally impossible to control. With one engine on the outboard at full reverse thrust could not be coped with, and the aircraft rolled over sadly and crashed.
That would have been an instantaneous occurrence, pretty well. It wouldn't have been much time.
Oh no, no time to remedy it. Unfortunately, it literally, and I think the training captain would probably be puzzled as to what had actually happened, and the co-pilot who was flying it at the time, and who survived, he went on to fly for many years, but he just had no possible ability to control it.
So it gave Air New Zealand good service between, I think, 65 and 81. Our ship left the fleet. It would be fair to say that this aircraft did take us into the jet age, and I mean it's a bit of a cliche, but it did break the tyranny of distance, didn't it? We could,
yes.
We could sort of move outside of the local area now,
yes,
in reasonable time. Where did you fly the 82? Where did it end up going to over those years?
Right. Well, almost immediately we did the Pacific Rim. Virtually, we of course we were doing Tasman, Hong Kong, Singapore, Hawaii, Los Angeles, and Tahiti. And so that circuit, and Fiji as well, and that circuit was serviced by the 8s. And in the early stages, it was not a frequent service. Very often we would actually fly to one of those destinations and stay there for a week until the next one came, and we'd go backwards in it, or go back home in it. It was very pleasant for us as crew members to sit in Hawaii for a week, or Hong Kong or Singapore, but that very quickly changed. And the airline, initially, the airline was an unknown from a passenger point of view, and so it took a while before people began to book. We very often carried only 1 or 2 passengers on a flight. And that very quickly changed because the quality of service that Air New Zealand provided was superb, and people recognised it. They were coming, in fact, it was often commented from people coming back from the UK that they'd arrive at Los Angeles and they'd get into an Air New Zealand DC-8 and they'd arrived home already. It was a really good service and good PR.
So the airline really just had to wear a period of time where load factors were sort of low, but anticipating that there would be growth.
Yep.
And I guess you've got to have the machine for that growth to happen.
Yes, yeah. And as I say, it happened fast. It was only really a couple of years before those flights that might have been almost empty were suddenly overbooked, where you were carrying heavy loads and also beginning to fly multiple flights into the service. Some
of those areas around the Pacific weren't that developed. What was it like flying into those areas? I guess there was rudimentary, some of those airports. It would have taken sort of all your skill on some occasions to arrive there, without any problem.
No, New Zealand Civil Aviation actually performed a good function in terms of developing airport facilities in terms of equipment, and I can't really recall any that were a real hassle. I mean, Fiji was well equipped, and there were both transit and terminal flights into Fiji, and then of course your Australian airports, no hassle. Hong Kong, the old Kai Tak airport, that was a bit of a fun, but then Singapore, also an older airport which changed over the years, and they were all well operable because there were other airlines operating into them. Hawaii, no problem at all. Los Angeles, the same. Los Angeles was a very, very busy airport way back in those days, and quite startling to arrive in the first time that you go in there, because you suddenly are aware that there are a large stream of aeroplanes that are landing from the east to the west, and the air traffic control would actually turn you onto final on, say, the right runway, and as you straightened out, you'd suddenly realise there was a jumbo jet sitting just a short distance away on your left-hand side on the other runway, and so it was busy in Los Angeles, but very, very well handled.
What about Kai Tak? That turn on to, I think it's a runway 13, isn't it? At Kai Tak, it's a sharp turn through the buildings. How was that in the DC-8?
It was startling unless you handled it really well.
Well, take us through. As you're flying towards the checkerboard, obviously you're slowing down. You know you've got to do this big turn at a very precise height. Speeds. You got crosswinds coming in. Take us sort of through how that would go.
Well, you drove at the checkerboard. In other words, that was your aiming point, and essentially you just kept on that path until you were aware of the fact that a turn was going to take you lined up onto the runway, and you would do a steep turn to the right. The co on that side would also be checking that, and you needed to be aware of crosswind situations so that as you rolled out and straightened up on the runway, that you were in the right position. If you in fact had overshot or undershot, you could end up just merely going round again and having to do the whole exercise again, which was a very time-consuming thing. You would, if you missed, you were possibly in the air for another good length of time to make it up. So I didn't have any problems with it. You flew the aircraft, shall we say, a lot more firmly and in a heavily controlled fashion to make sure that you actually got that lined up.
What about power? Did you need to kick in quite a bit of power on that final turn?
No, you were almost in a gliding turn at that stage.
Something you'd look forward to. That's a good way to end up the flight. Bit of action there.
Yes, well, I don't know whether it's worthwhile quoting a funny story, but when we were staying any length of time in a destination point, we were allowed to take family members, and I took Andrew, our son, on that trip into Hong Kong, and as we were coming in, I asked the navigator who sits behind the captain if Andrew could sit there and watch the approach as we came in and landed. And so he did that, and I managed to make a nice, smooth landing. And we drove off into the hotel, and Andrew was obviously taking in all the sights of Hong Kong. And we got into our hotel room and I shut the door, and Andrew just turned to me and said, "Maybe you do earn your money." so
maybe.
Yes, he was he was slightly impressed, shall we say, by the trip, by the landing.
The operation into Wellington, I think they began in the early 70s. You know the date. I think it was 71 the first one arrived, but I don't know if the regular services, they might have started a year or two after that. But that seemed to me to be, as a kid back in the day, watching those DC-8s come in to land at Wellington from afar, and at the airport we used to go out there. A lot of people used to go out there and watch them. That looked pretty tight, I got to say. The runway was, I think, under 6,000 feet at that point, or about that. You had high terrain at one end. You're dealing with an aircraft that's really made to operate from longer runways and probably wasn't quite designed for that sort of situation. How was it? Tell us about that part of the operation.
Well, when you'd flown literally thousands of hours in DC-3s in and out of Wellington Airport, it was familiar territory, so no hassle from that point of view. They showed us a technique which was a reverse rotation kind of device to, if you like, get the aircraft in the right position where you flared the aircraft and quite critically, and then literally pushed the nose forward and plonked it on the ground quite early and perhaps a little more heavily than usual, but it fitted well. If you did everything, no real hassle. It was. In fact, for those of us that had flown in and out of Wellington with National Airways for all those years in threes, in fact, I flew right there, right in the Herons, right before there was a runway there, and it was familiar ground.
Yeah. But that technique was to minimise what runway use, get touchdown early.
Yes. You would hold the aircraft in in a kind of a tail down flare attitude from quite early on. You needed in a northerly to make sure that you were above the downdraft at the southern end of the runway, which unfortunately trapped the Vulcan during the approach. And that was a thing that we all knew about, and I don't think anyone had passed on that. In fact, if you got yourself too low in the approach position, there was a continual downdraft at that end of the runway in a northerly, and you needed to make sure that you were above the height at the end of the runway, where in fact it was turning downhill, because you fell into it. Otherwise, if you got yourself too low, you were literally dragged down by that downdraft.
And it had plenty of power, the 8, when you needed it?
Yes, it did. And sometimes you needed to make sure you made use of it early, but if you kept the engine spooled up to the right power setting, you could get power almost instantly. It responded extremely well.
What about up high? What's the highest you ever took it?
Because of we only ever flew it at 39,000 normally. The reason being that the cabin setting, the pressurization setting at 39,000, you were at the point where the cabin was getting down towards 8,000 or 9,000 feet, and so you didn't want to take it any higher, because passengers would be starting, especially if anyone was oxygen dependent. You didn't want to be any higher. And on one occasion, to avoid some quite serious weather, I took it up to 41,000 feet, and for only a short period, and it worked well, no hassle.
It's no problem sort of climbing that little bit extra?
No.
What would your climb rate be at that altitude?
Oh golly, I don't know. Can't remember. It would, because of the fact that you would be lighter, because you'd burnt off fuel and things. It was actually comparatively light at that stage. It would just be like a normal climb, 500 feet a minute or thereabouts, and it would take you only a few minutes to do that 39 to 41,000.
And it was, I think, I looked at the data, it was capable of 600 miles an hour. That was its basically top speed. What's it, about Mach 0.82 or 4 or something like that? What did you used to fly it at cruising speed?
Most of the work that we did was 8.1. That was the airliners that were operating between the American mainland and Hawaii and further down, to keep them all, if they were following each other in a stream, to make sure that nobody caught up to anyone else. The general trend was to fly at 0.81, Mach 8.1.
And the difference between the 707 and the DC-8, you commented on it when we talked on the phone, other people have mentioned it too, the wing sweep had something to do with what people perceive as a better quality ride over the 707. Explain how that works.
Right. Well, as you sweep wings backwards, the aircraft becomes subject to what's known as Dutch roll, where if there's any instability, you're jumping back one, the maintaining of kind of arrow stability with the rudder, and so you're kind of like an arrow, is dependent on the rudder and the length, the moment between the rudder and the centre of gravity and centre of pressure, so that the shorter that becomes, then the less control you have. And so as the wing is swept back, it moves the aerodynamic status of the wing closer to the rudder, and that shorter length means that if it's unstable and rocks from side to side, then it tends, rather than to stabilise out as a rudder should do, the wing that moves forward as it rocks increases its lift, and so it rises, and then because it does that, it moves backwards because it's also gains in drag, and then as that happens, the other wing starts to move forward, rises and moves back, and you get this rocking motion from side to side, which becomes very difficult to control if you don't learn how. And this is what they call Dutch roll. And it has the ability, if you're not trained in it, to literally flip the aircraft. You can actually roll the aircraft over. Japan Airlines, when they've got their 8s, they had near disaster with an aircraft where they couldn't control the Dutch roll, and it flipped over, and I think they lost engine pods off it. Yeah.
It would have been an alarming thing to be part of.
Yeah, and so going back to the 707, the 707 had more sweepback than the 8, which theoretically meant that it could go faster with less drag and was a faster aeroplane, but it had a very much higher tendency to Dutch roll. The 8 was more stable. You could fly the 8 by hand in those conditions. The 707, there was what was called a yaw damper built in, both to the 707 and the 8, and that yaw damper assisted this to recover this Dutch roll problem.
Right. Okay. Well, that maybe that's why Air New Zealand decided to choose the DC-8 just for a slightly smoother ride, maybe.
Well, I don't think that came into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Now, one of the I've got to ask you about this. One of the well-known DC-8 stories, because it was reported widely in the media at the time. I remember it as a sort of a young teen, hearing about the big controversy, and I think you were in the aircraft at the time, and that is this low approach over Newlands. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone explain actually what happened there, apart from maybe some sensationalised reporting.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't, maybe it was back in the day. You know how the media can be.
Yeah.
I think we're back in 1975, and pretty well.
Yep.
After that was pretty well it for you flying those airliners. What happened there?
Yeah, it was the 21st of September, and I remember it was a Sunday evening, and we were going Christchurch to Fiji with a Wellington stop-off, so we were landing at Wellington, and essentially I elected to do what was known as a twin locator approach, where you use beacons to do it. So we were operating the Porrua beacon, the Newlands beacon, and Wellington.
NDB beacons,
NDBs, yes. And so I was doing that rather than using any radar or any other one. So began to do the approach. We were turned on to the final approach by radar, and much to my amazement, and I think the other crew as well, we began our descent, and quite suddenly we crossed over Newlands, and we thought, now that's a bit early, but we were in a northerly wind at the top, so we knew that we were being pushed along with that wind, and so we did a kind of a fast descent to increase our rate of descent to where we were expecting to be in the Wellington harbour. And quite suddenly, there in front of us was a whole bunch of houses. So we did the usual thing. We poured on a lot of power and shot away, and went round, and we got radar to monitor us on a second approach, and that seemed to work out okay. To cut it very short, what happened was that they found civil aviation began to explore the beacon and any performance of it. There'd been other reports of happenings with aircraft and the Newlands beacon that nobody could kind of pin down. So they ran what's known as a goniometer, which is a radio compass setup north from Newlands, and there is a power wire passing Newlands going to Haywards, where the Hayward substation. And they found to their amazement that every dangle from an insulator running for miles north, there was a Newlands beacon. And the power wire was picking up the Newlands signal and retransmitting it. And obviously the aircraft had become locked in to the Newlands beacon, which was a couple of miles north. In fact, that's what it worked out at. So it was not regarded with a great deal of joy One is that the Newlands residents had been trying for years to get the government to believe that, in fact, they were not in a very safe situation, and we proved it. And so that was one thing, and it was a matter of politics and local politics and everything else like that, and airline embarrassment, if you like. So I was the bad boy who had done it. So I over the years bore the stigma, if you like, of that. And what happened was I was put through a year of what was euphemistically called retraining. I had been at that stage a check and training captain, and then here I was being retrained. And at the end of the year, when I was supposed to receive my command, it was made fairly obvious to me that I was just not going to get my command back. So I resigned in anger, in fact, in some ways. And I have since received an apology from Air New Zealand over the way in which the matter was handled, and for which I was most grateful. And yes, Rob Fyfe actually initiated an apology for the family, and which we accepted. And
it's interesting because you describe that they find out why this happened. How that has anything to do with you, I don't know. You're relying on stuff that is supposed to be totally reliable, and it's somebody else's business to make sure that's reliable.
Yes.
How do you explain that attitude that would come back to you and sort of almost victimise you? It sounds
well, it was there was a cult of perfectionism, if you like. You don't make mistakes. It was a kind of an Air Force derived thing in many ways, and there can be no weak links. And so if you do something which is it proves to be a weak link, you're not welcome.
Even though it's really got nothing to do with you.
No, that's right. And the interesting thing is that there were quite a few cases, evidently, of other aircraft. There were friendships and Bristol freighters and things who used the Newlands beacon regularly, and there had been reports about problems. And the interesting thing is that we actually had this, and it was actually spelt out to us when we were flying on back to. Incidentally, we checked the aircraft and found there was nothing wrong, and so we continued on to Fiji. That was probably the wrong thing. I should have stayed and stamped up and down, but I didn't. And so we flew on, and while we were flying on, we were asked were we going to put a report in about the Newlands beacon, and I said, well, I honestly don't know that it is the Newlands beacon that's at fault. And they said, oh, we've had quite a few reports over the years. And that was from the controller. And when we said this in our reports, and I and the engineer and the co-pilot wrote separate reports. I didn't see any of them. They handed them in. And these went to civil aviation. And when we went to civil aviation, when civil aviation kind of ran us through the hoops, they said, you say about this previous problems, we've never had any problems at all. So I said, well, you go and listen to the tape from the controller and you'll see what said. So they did, and it was highly embarrassing because none of the problems had all been verbal. No one had ever put anything in writing. So it was one of those interesting little situations.
And I'm just thinking, while you're talking about that, it wasn't too long after that the Erebus thing happened, and that's another thing. But maybe the same attitudes came to the fore there, because quite a few people were thrown under the bus in that situation. Sadly,
it was unfortunately very similar, and to me it was I was because I knew and really had a great respect for Jim Collins, and it was in fact a matter of great sorrow for me that in fact, and several had said that if they'd in fact followed through on our situation, Erebus may not have occurred, and that was, to me, that hurt.
Because that might have, broken a culture that existed.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
And that was an extremely sad situation. And
I guess you got to live with some things.
yes, that's right.
At least you had the experience when you think back to those days.
Yeah,
And it's decades ago now.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the sort of memories you have? That's been a great time.
The aircraft.
Well, just the whole experience of.
Oh yes, it did. I consider myself very lucky to have flown when I did, as I say, having started thinking about flying when I was 3 years old, right through to the time of being in my, 60s, 50s, and even right through till now, I'm still involved in aviation. I'm a member of both the Aero Club out here and the Aviation Museum, which is a great place.
Well, hopefully we can get this. I should actually know next week. Finally, we're just waiting on a legal letter from the company that owned this, what used to be NZC, which you must have flown many times.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any individual variation between the aircraft? Could you?
They were virtually identical. Yeah, there was virtually no difference. And as I say, it was the last of the old style flight decks and instrumentations, where you had dials and not TV screens to watch, and each of the aircraft you could walk into any of them, and you'd just have to check on the nameplate on the control panel to or at least the instrumentation panel to determine which one you were in, and doing walkarounds and things like that. They were virtually identical, which was good.
Well, the mass-produced machines, really, I guess that's the concept, isn't it?
And not only that, but engineering staff. Air New Zealand engineering staff was superb. They really, really were and are. You could rely on them very, very much.
And I'm taking it that you'll be happy to know that this thing has been saved from the knacker's yard, literally. It's
Yes.
the only one left.
Yes.
All the others, I think the most recent one that was still around went over a decade ago. So
Yes.
this is the last one left.
Yeah.
And hopefully you'll be feeling happy that one day we'll get it back here.
Yes.
And
yes.
And future generations who maybe end up flying for a career that just sort of walking around in kids' clothes now can go and have a look and see how it all happened.
Yeah. Yes, well, it'll be marvellous to actually see it, actually tidied up to some degree, and whatever degree that they actually do decide to do it up. But even if they've only got the sharp end and the seating and control panels, if they're all able to be to be brought back to life to some degree, that would be good. I became aware of this many years ago, actually, of NZC, and the possibility of bringing it back from Manus, and I was sad that nothing happened at the time, and now that it has, it's good.
Well, not too far away before we start handing over some money. So
Right.
once that's been handed over, it's definitely official then.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that I might not have mentioned, or is there something that comes to mind that you want to?
As far as the 8's concerned, no, I don't think so. After I left, because I left flying in 77, that was when I finally wound up. And interestingly enough, I was so involved in my own family electronics industry that we were running that you'd almost say I abandoned aviation. It wasn't really quite like that. It was just that I was too busy doing things to be too much involved. So the final departure, the passage of the DC-10 and the final disappearance of the 8 literally passed me by. I just wasn't, and Erebus kind of was very much an involvement, and I sat in on virtually the whole of the Erebus inquiry, and so that was really where I parted company with aviation. But coming here and retiring to Paraparaumu, the museum here has got some enthusiastic people to preserve a lot of the history of aviation, which of course includes the 8 and a lot of other aircraft. And so it's nice to be part of that.
And of course, this part of the country is, I mean, this is where NAC used to operate from in this area. I think Palmerston North is where it started, but this was a significant base of operations for NAC in the early days.
Oh yes, we were very, very busy. And we, as I say, we flew from here to every airfield in the country, every aerodrome and airfield, right down to Invercargill and right up to Kaitaia, and to east and west coast as well, New Plymouth and Gisborne and Napier, and so it was very good. We had a very good kind of introduction, if you like, to every airfield in the country.
And good experience for what came later, by the sounds of things.
I think so. Yes. We because we flew in and out of before Wellington runway was developed. We flew in and out of some quite interesting airfields, and of course, flying the Heron before the runway was built, that was an interesting experience as well, because I had done training in Tiger Moths in the old Wellington Aero Club, and that was essentially on a grass field. And then the Heron, and then out here when they were building the runway. Mm-hmm.
I've seen footage of the Herons coming and going at Wellington, and it looked like it was a bit of a, well, not much. At the southern end, you were sort of swooping down over a cliff almost, in what it looked like from the footage. Maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but it sort of looked like it...
well, it was Moa Point existed then. Moa Point eventually disappeared because it was used for fill. But it was a kind of, you slid down this into a nor'wester wind, which was at an angle from the present runway, and you literally slid down. The de Havilland factory was kind of nestled in the same place, and I think it gave passengers a little concern, shall we say.
Welcome to Wellington.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I think they still get a bit of that.
Oh yes.
Okay, one more question, Don. People are sitting here watching you talk about these wonderful old days of flying the DC-8, and they're probably noticing in the top right-hand corner behind you, there is something that looks suspiciously like a BAFTA award, an actual BAFTA award. You're going to have to give us a quick explanation just to satisfy that curiosity.
It is a real BAFTA, and it was presented to our son Andrew by one no less than Michael Palin, and that was at the British Awards. He was nominated for an Oscar for The Truman Show, which was his first major movie move, and he didn't get the Oscar. Both Barbara, my wife, and I were able to actually go to the Oscars, which was a good fun experience. But he ended up getting a BAFTA, and that is his BAFTA. However, people who get BAFTAs can ever hold them in one hand, I do not know. It's like it is a very heavy device, which Andrew presented to us actually as a doorstop, and it also happens to grace our lounge here. But yes, so that was Andrew's first major movie effort, and so we're most grateful to him for it.
Oh, it's a wonderful achievement, and it was a fantastic movie too. What an interesting concept The Truman Show was. I think Jim Carrey was...
That's right, yes. Yes, and then he went on to Gattaca and Lord of War and a whole series of movies that have become quite major movies. Gattaca is a kind of a classic movie now, where it's used for teaching purposes, teaching in ethics because of the ethical nature of gene modification and things like that. So Gattaca, as I say, is quite a major movie as well.
And what was that BAFTA and particularly for? Did he write it? Did he direct it?
The original screenplay, I think, was what he got on it. It's got it written on it. I'm sorry I don't read it often enough.
Probably too heavy to pick up.
Yes, right, yes. So, yes, it was in terms of the screenwriting.